Singularity.
My name is Nicola, aka Socrates, and you're watching Singularity FM, the place where we interview the future. And today, my guest on the show will be a musician, a keynote speaker, a futurist, and an author named Gerd Leonhard, who is most recently the author of a very interesting book called Technology versus Humanity, the coming clash between man and machine. So hi, Gerd, and welcome to Singularity FM.
Hello there. Nice to connect here.
Fantastic. So, Gerd, let me start our conversation today with a simple admission. I've been doing this for 7 years now, and obviously I've been doing it very poorly because I never knew that there was another person who also is very interested in bringing in the issue of ethics within the realm of technology, and let alone someone of your standing, experience, and kind of breadth and width of work. So I admit this was a great gap in my kind of education, if you will, personally speaking. And I only discovered you maybe about a month and a half ago. When I saw your book mentioned for the first time, and since then it's been revelation. I read the book, I watched a bunch of your keynotes, I watched you even going and playing some hardcore riffs on the electric guitar, which were quite phenomenal too.
Okay, thank you.
So
it's a big world, right? I mean, there's so many people doing interesting things. It's amazing.
And it goes to show you something that I've been saying many times before, that no matter what we do and who we are, our ignorance would always end up dwarfing our knowledge in the end of the day.
Yes, that's where the machines come in, I suppose.
And I'm supposed to be Socrates, so I'm supposed to know that I don't know better than anybody else. But sometimes I even forget that. So anyway, let me start our conversation first with this question. If you were to introduce yourself in a couple of words, who is Gerd Leonhard?
Well, I would say I'm first and foremost a humanist, somebody who comes from the background of humanities, music, art, and then secondary, a technologist maybe, but a futurist, somebody who's interested in the future, a lot of public speaking. That's already quite a few words there, right? And maybe a change agent for my clients, for my people that read my books, and a traveler. I travel a lot, but also, in thoughts, I travel.
That's very well said. So if we take the last idea that you're a traveler, tell us a little bit about your journey. Where did it start? Where did it originate? And why did you decide to undertake such journey in the realm of philosophy? What was it that grabbed you and told you, Gerd, this is what you have to do with your life?
Well, yeah, okay, it's a long story, but I'll try to make it short. But basically, I started off with when I was a kid in Germany. I grew up in Germany, right? And I was always interested in philosophy. So I went to college, university in Bonn in Germany to study theology and philosophy. But then very quickly, I was always a musician. So music took over. I moved to San Francisco. Then I went to Berkeley College in Boston. I became a musician, a producer. So I really come from the creative business, right? And then in the mid-90s, I discovered the internet, and I discovered with one swoop that the internet was going to be the biggest change in how we live and how we do things. And so I became an internet entrepreneur. I had bunch of people invest in my companies. I did about a dozen startups, but I realized very early that my strength wasn't actually in necessarily monetizing my ideas or building companies, but to develop foresight to help people shape their own things with my foresight. So I was always very early. For example, I started something like Spotify in 1999. Of course, it was way too early. And then I wrote a book called The Future of Music, which is what Spotify is modeled after, music like water. And that became a bestseller. So I realized very quickly that I was good at seeing the future, in what I call the immediate future, not far away, 5 years or 7 or 8 years. And that became something I practiced, and over the years, and now it's been 15 years now, pretty much, I realized I had a gift for seeing that and also for talking about it. And it was also a very good mix of the technology background that I acquired in my internet days, but also the humanities background. So I'm more of a business philosopher, technology philosopher, a humanist, and I'm very quite unusual in the sense of a futurist, and I'm not totally excited about everything that's far-fetched technology. I have critique also, and I prefer to think of myself as a nowist. Somebody talking about now, but that's not really a word. So anyway, then I started a company 5 years ago called the Futures Agency, and there's about 40 of us, and we help companies to futurize themselves, mostly incumbent companies who are seeing big trouble, car companies, brands, big media companies, pretty much all over the map. And that has become a huge thing. And now we're making films about the future. And I wrote this book because I thought it was a very good time to think about how humanity is changing because of technology. And what it means, because the key point in the book is that technology is now basically capable of anything. Very soon, nothing that we want to do is out of reach, and then we have to decide why we want to do this and who is doing it, right? And that becomes the key question.
Now, before we jump into the book, I want to spend a little bit more time on your own personal background and your journey, because first you called yourself a traveler, but also I want to find out if it's. I mean, you do have a very interesting journey in the sense that you go through music and theology to get to futurism and business consulting and advising and so on. What do you think does this kind of a background provide that, let's say, the traditional startup entrepreneur may lack or may benefit from?
I think it's very hard to say. I think the background in having studied philosophy and the ancient Greek, having studied Latin, Greek, and Hebrew, it was kind of a punishment. But you do learn the background of philosophy and how humans think, and that becomes a very big asset once you've gone through all that stuff, right? And as a musician, of course, you always in a situation where you have to invent yourself, right? Most musicians are only successful if they are entrepreneurs. So entrepreneurship and musicianship goes together. If you're not an entrepreneur, you'll never get any work as a musician unless you're just a genius, right? But I wasn't. So, and that's been a good journey. And then understanding technology, as a guitar player, you're always fiddling with knobs and setting up boxes and using technology and working on sound, right? So understanding technology and being excited about technology, that was always a very, very big thing for me. And so this is how I got into the startup business, because I understood technology instinctively. Yeah.
And what about theology? Where does theology fit? Back in the day when you studied it in Bonn in the 1980s, and I mean, it was Lutheran theology, wasn't it?
Yes, well, the thing is, I was as a young kid, I was religious. Afterwards, I wasn't. It's not about religion for me at all. I mean, what I do today has nothing to do with religion. It's all about ethics and understanding of people rather than some god or something. I like Richard Dawkins' book. The God Delusion. That's kind of where I come from. So I have no agenda as far as religion is concerned. I understand it obviously, but. So that's not really my background, but I do understand the sort of discussion about spiritual things and about other things than algorithms. I come from that. But in Germany, the study of theology is very much a study of philosophy. And as a Lutheran minister, if I had become a Lutheran minister, you end up doing sort of, social work, collective work, community work that happens to be paid for by the church, but it's not at all like in the US.
Hold on a second. You are a Lutheran minister?
No, I would have become one if I had gone through with it, right?
Oh, I see.
But I finished the basic studies, and then I quit to study music, and moved to America. So I had always had this call for the West, going out and inventing something, and that became something I did from '82 to roughly 2001.
Very interesting. Okay, so now we're coming to about 2001. Was that sort of the timeline or the time frame that you started getting interested in the future?
Well, as an entrepreneur, I started about a dozen companies, and I was always very future focused in saying, okay, this is definitely going to work. I know this is going to work, right? And my investors believed me, unfortunately for them, because they lost all their money. But in the process of pitching, I raised, I don't know, not tens of millions, but a lot of money as an investor. And so I had a gift for talking about stories and having people believe my stories. Right? And I discovered that when I was, I pitched at least 200 times for various startups, that I did. And then I realized very early that I actually was quite good at pitching and also understanding how to present stuff, right? And how to minimize the understanding that was required, to actually follow. And so I was always very interested in the future. For example, when I started this music company called Sonific, roughly in the early 2000s, it was very much like what Spotify is today, but obviously it was 10 years too early. And I realized when I wrote my first book, The Future of Music, which became a bestseller, that I wasn't wrong. I was just always too early. And so then I kind of made a job out of being too early. But today I have to say that I'm not really early anymore. I'm just a little bit ahead of the curve, 2 or 3 years, because technology has caught up, has been faster.
So if you were to describe what you do before we get into the book, let's say me and you are in the elevator and I'm a potential someone who may be interested in something that you do. And if I were to ask you to give me the elevator pitch, what is it that you do? Can you give it to us?
Well, I think I'm kind of a giant filter. I explain really complicated things to people that are interested in changing. And a lot of my clients, my company works with over 300 clients. It's all the way from Microsoft to, some local government or something, right? And basically, we're translating the important things that are happening around us. We're translating that to them to get them to tackle their future and create it, right? So it's basically a translation process. Sometimes I say it's like therapy, because a lot of CEOs come to me and say, "Oh, I don't know what the hell is going on in the world anymore." Right? Or the HR people come to me and say, "These guys don't know what the hell is going on," and then they bring me in, and then basically I kind of coach, or we take this future therapy. We actually call it future therapy, which is to open up the thinking and say, okay, this is actually going to happen. Right? This is not just some mad people in California. This is actually happening, and this is very important.
Yeah. Okay, very interesting. So where does the book fit within this picture? Why did you have to write a book? You already have a thriving business. You have done 1,500 engagements with, hundreds of customers in 50 countries and so on. Why write a book and why now?
Well, I think I've done this more or less business centric speaking, and I'm very good at helping business people in getting the future and getting ready for it. And there's a huge demand for that, because one thing is, for example, that many of my clients don't have anybody talking to them openly about this, right? So when you're the CEO of a company with 100,000 people, you don't get an honest take on the future, right? Nobody talks to you about anything real, because you're too powerful, then, or maybe too old, or you have too much money. But so that's what I do. But the interesting part is, in the last couple of years, the biggest conversations I had with people is that they're really worried about technology basically changing every component of our life. And many of them are good, right? I mean, for example, disruption of businesses and new ideas and stuff, but also changing who we are as people. For example, by augmenting ourselves, forcing ourselves to use technology to get better, faster, and eventually merging with machines. And this thought of merging with machines is something that's not as far-fetched as it may seem, but it's also very much accepted idea in the US. In Europe, that is a total no-go, right? Because we are, collectively speaking, not interested in machines, right? We just have a whole different culture. We are, that is the last thing that we want. And so it became a very big topic among my clients to ask me, it's like, oh, isn't this all going to end with the robots killing us, right? I don't believe that's the case, but I'm more of an optimist there. But so it became a real topic, and then I started collecting topics on this technology versus humanity, and the book title is kind of a provocation. It's not actually meant versus, it's more like with, right? So it became a big topic, right?
Yeah, we'll get to the title in a second, but I'm trying to kind of lead us and unravel perhaps the idea of What is it that's worrying you the most, Gerd? What is your greatest fear?
Well, in general, let's put it this way. I'm not really a worry on this. I think we're right now at 90% of positive level of technology. I think the opportunities of technologies are absolutely mind-boggling. Right? We can solve diseases. We can solve the energy problem. We can solve education. We can solve possibly even inequality if we do it right. But there's so many side effects of technology that we also need to govern. Right? We need to administer, we need to agree on, and we're currently not doing that. So my biggest worry is that we're using all the great power of technology, but we're empowering technology in such a way that it is completely just goes out and just sweeps us away, right? And some of that is not a big deal, like we're swept away by Facebook, okay, we can live with that, right? But if we're going to get swept with the idea of creating a virtual reality interface that basically becomes a default, that would not be a good idea, right? And so it's the balance I'm concerned with. We're going to use technology. We're not going to go backwards. We're not going to shut off technology, and we don't want to. Right? But we need to have more precaution about what exactly it will do and who is in charge. Right? This is also a key worry. Is that right now? I think many of my clients are in charge, and that also worries me. But if you think that the future is determined by Silicon Valley and the military, then I am not so happy because yes, they're inventing all that stuff, but should they tell us what we're going to be? I think that is a bad idea.
Yeah, I have to agree with you on that one very much, just like on many other things, by the way, in the book. And generally on most of your concerns, in fact. And actually, not long ago, I did a presentation in Rotterdam that's called "The Emperor Has No Clothes."
Okay.
That ended up pissing off probably the most powerful and richest people that I know personally, at the heart of Silicon Valley, of course. But anyway, so I can sympathize with your plight and your concerns. In other
But
words,
by the way, here's the important part though, is that Silicon Valley is no longer what it was, right? The Silicon Valley used to be the place where everybody was just looking in this direction. And all of a sudden, there's a movement among, as you can see last week with the announcement of the partnership for AI, and where companies are saying, you know what, we are responsible for what we're creating. Just like the gun guys are responsible for creating guns and selling them for cheap, right?
they wouldn't admit so, but
Yeah, and this is you can start feeling this, right? And so it is basically coming to the admission that technology is not the purpose of our lives, right? And that's going to be very hard for the CEO of IBM to say, but that is the underlying reality I think that they're starting to realize. And so what is the purpose of a world that is a giant machine? There would be no purpose. I think this is starting to be something accepted practice, and I'm certain that in 5 years, what I call digital ethics becomes a business model, becomes a model of saying this is the value of a company. It's going to be about those things. It's not going to be about some app or something.
well, that's phenomenal then, because for the past 7 years, my thesis on my blog and everything that I had done has gone under the message that, quote, technology is not enough. And that we often forget that, and my suggestion has been to propose that we need ethics, which is exactly your message. You even call it digital ethics, I mean. And you
Right.
have, of course, a much longer history than I do in the field. So that's fantastic. Let's move on now to the sort of the meat of the matter as it is represented by the body of work, that's to say, your book.
Okay.
So let's start with the title. Technology versus humanity. Why such a provocative title, and just elaborate on that, if you will.
Well, I think if you imagine on a sliding scale from 1 to 10, technology on the left, humanity on the right, all of us are now being forced to take a position and say, at which point do we put the slider towards humans or towards technology? It's no longer good enough to say that technology will solve everything, because it doesn't. Technology cannot solve happiness. There's no app for happiness, and there's no app against terrorism. Despite what Silicon Valley sometimes says, this is what they believe. If you listen to all of what they're saying, right, is that there's a purpose beyond technology. Technology is a tool, and so the title is made to say, you know what, if we don't watch out, technology becomes so significant, and we we can get to this place to where we feel like we can't do anything without any of this. Right? It's like the pilot who can't fly because the entire controls are automated, and by the time it's ready for action, he doesn't know what to do, or he's just bored, or he's working on his iPad, right? And this is happening increasingly. It's basically the glass cockpit problem, right? And if you look at, if you go into the future 5 years, and technology is everywhere, then you have to ask the questions: are we still capable of doing anything, or have we forgotten ourselves in this context? And that is a very big question. So the title is meant to shake up things, and I think ideally speaking, we would want humanity on top of technology. Mm-hmm. But that's not going to happen by itself, because humanity doesn't make money. Humanity is something that is built into our lives, and it's a human thing that we don't monetize, right? And therein lies the danger. When you're just looking to monetize, you're not going to go out and say, I sell humanity, right? Then you'd be the Dalai Lama or something, I mean, there's no business in selling humanity. And so that is a steep challenge.
And what would you say? I've interviewed on my show about 200 other futurists like you. And one of them was, or the first one that comes to my mind right now, kind of on your title, Technology versus Humanity, is the author of Robopocalypse, Daniel H. Wilson, who is, by the way, a PhD in robotics from Carnegie Mellon. And when I asked him, so you wrote the book Robopocalypse, are we to fear the robots and the coming of the AI and stuff? He said, well, people often create the mythology that, there's this clash between technology and humanity, and that we fight technology in the shape of robots, and eventually we win. But you see, he says this is bullshit, because we are technology. We cannot fight technology because we are technology. What would you say about that?
Well, I mean, this, of course, I've heard this argument many times before. The thing is that, yeah, you can say that we are technology, we are biological, which is technology, or chemical, right? However, I think that there's two options here, right? Either we're just extremely sophisticated technology, so that we currently don't understand how sophisticated. It will take another 100 years to figure that out. That's one option. And the other option is that technology eventually becomes philosophy, becomes existence, becomes consciousness that we will not solve by putting it into zeros and ones. And that is a basic question of what you believe. I think at this point it's a moot discussion, because we are at that point where we say we don't understand. If we were technology, we don't even understand how we work. Right? And so my position on this is that if we're going to put technology into robots and AI and computers and software, let them go and have cognitive computing and let machines think. That's fine. They can think completely differently than I am. That's enough value that we can ever hope for, right? Mm-hmm. But what I'm against that is to say that we are technology, and therefore our destiny is to merge with technology that we have created. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Because I believe it's a downgrade. It's not an upgrade, because what technology is already doing is it's saying to us that, don't bother with real dating or building relationships. Just use Tinder and, same result, right? But of course, we know that it's not the same result. It's a wormhole, right? It's a shortcut, right? Just like saying that, you're friends with all your great buddies on Facebook. They're not friends like regular friends, right? Right? They are just, it's a parallel world, right? And if we understand that technology offers us a chance of going into a parallel world and exploring new things and becoming ourselves on the social media web, great. But if we confuse that with ourselves, that is my view, that is where confusion starts, and that leads to all kinds of subsequent effects and dehumanization, in fact.
Mm-hmm. One of my favorite lines in your book, and I have quite a few very nice quotes that I got that we'll get to talk about, but one of my favorite ones is, technology is not what we seek, but how we seek. Talk to us a little bit about that.
Yeah, I think there's a common confusion now in that technology is, because it's so powerful, it's so much magic, right? Everywhere you look, it's magical technology. The fact that we can do this is magic. The fact I can send a message to Namibia to my son or something through WhatsApp, that's magic, right? And every day there's a new magic. I can drive a self-driving car, I have a language translator, I can analyze my DNA, magic, magic, magic. And that's all good, but at a certain point, the magic becomes kind of manic, right? and then it takes on its own life. And I think the best example for that, it really is Facebook, because Facebook has taken on its own life as a pleasure trap, forcing us into itself, and we are the content that's being consumed. That it's been an utter perversion of friendship, right? And yet it has its own purpose that I use, right? It's not that I don't use it, but this is the kind of where the tool has become the purpose, right?
Right.
And Facebook has now its own purpose, which is to make money.
For Facebook, of course, yeah.
And that's fine. Yeah, I'm not saying that's bad. I'm just saying that as if we believe that this is our tool, we are their tool, right? Mm-hmm. And if we can deal with that with Facebook. We can stomach that, right? But if technology becomes a purpose all around us, it encroaches what I am. Removes my free will. Does things with me that I'd rather not see happening, and reduces what I can do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and in support of what you said, by the way, that people try to cultivate as many Facebook friendships as possible, and that often comes at the expense of cultivating real friendship with real people in real relationship with real human meat body time spent with each other. And one example was taken to extreme was, of course, that couple in Korea, which let their baby starve to death while trying to do the best possible things for their virtual baby in a virtual world, right?
Well, it's kind of it's a very tempting situation that technology creates really powerful vortexes, of an echo chamber of contacts. And you feel good doing that, right? But it's exactly the same than any other drug, really. It has sort of a recreational purpose, right? But you can have a glass of wine in the evening, or even more, or do whatever you want to do. But you wouldn't drink a bottle of gin for breakfast. And this is the kind of balance that we currently are missing. And so if this goes on, the exponential scale that we're seeing, we're at 4 now, we're going to go to 128 and eventually to 1 billion in 30 steps, right? Mm-hmm. You can only imagine what will happen here if we are exponentially hooked on that kind of technology.
I can't even imagine myself, but I can try.
Right? We will forget who we are, and we will become machines ourselves. I like to say, as I say in the book, the biggest danger is not the machines will kill us. That'll be a long time before they can do that, or that they will replace us. The biggest danger is that we become too much like the machine, right? Because the machine says, "Oh, do it like this," switch on the notification, arrange a date through genetic engineering, and control what your baby looks like, and it's all these options, right? And eventually you get to be a machine because that's all you know how to do.
Now, I supplied this technology is not what we seek, but how we seek, as a favorite quote of mine from your book. But is that the thesis, or do you have a better, more clear thesis than this? What is your book's thesis, in other words?
Well, there's quite a few summaries, and this is one of them. Is a caution of saying that we shouldn't confuse technology with our purpose, and part of that is saying that we have abundance now because technology is giving us abundance, but technology is not good at providing actual happiness. It's very good at hedonic happiness. I can feel hedonically happy when you like my post on Facebook, and I say, "Oh, that's great. I feel happy for half a second." But this doesn't actually it doesn't create a relationship, right? And as they say in positive psychology, in this whole school of Seligman, he talks about PERMA, which is purpose and engagement, relationships, meaning, and accomplishment. And those are all things that happen between people. Right? And so one of the central theories in the book is to say technology will make a lot of things easier, but it cannot be a purpose, and it cannot actually be creating this kind of what's called a eudaimonia in Greek philosophy, which is contentment in Buddhist philosophy. Right? So my point is that we use technology for all of that stuff, and we can use it as a tool. We should just not look for it to make us happy. Right?
Right. And you talk about happiness and well-being as things that should be at the center of our kind of existence. Can you elaborate a little more on that, perhaps?
Yeah, I think when you look at a lot of technological innovations and new transformations that we're seeing, for example, whether it's online banking or holograms, or very soon holographic travel, or cancer therapy, and the question we always have to ask ultimately, what is the purpose of this technology? Is the purpose to replace a human piece that I used to do, or is it to empower me to do what I need to do, right? Or does it have its own purpose, which is what I call a secondary purpose, right? Which essentially is telling me that it's good for me, but really what it does, it's good for itself, right? And that's increasingly the case. And so sometimes inadvertent, sometimes more overt, right? So, for example, a technology that's just now being trialed is the exogenesis, which is to give birth outside of your body. Right? Yeah. The concept that you would have an artificial womb to have your baby rather than have your actual baby, because it's convenient, right? And we don't have all the hassle of being pregnant. I mean, I'm a man. What can I talk about? But anyway, and this idea is so ludicrous because in the end, this is just a way to monetize, right? It's not a human solution.
What about women who are unable to give birth to their kids because they have cancer in the uterus or something like that, which this would be a solution for them, right? To have kids.
Yeah, well, it is a very hard decision to make, but it's quite different than when you're sick than when you're not, right? I mean, for example, the fact that 40% of Brazilian women have cesarean because they can schedule it before they go play golf, that's it's kind of a weird thing, right? I mean, what can you do about that?
Brazilians play soccer, not golf.
Yeah, okay, yeah, okay. They have tea afterwards or whatever. But I think that eventually we also have to distinguish between sickness and disease and what we do with those people. Then with voluntary things that become an aberration, really, right? I mean, this would be just as true. Like if you have cancer and we have a cancer technology to change the genes, that would be obviously a good purpose, right? Mm-hmm. Nobody wants to have cancer. But if I then turn that around and say, let me use that technology to create a super soldier, right? Same technology in principle, bad purpose. So at some point, we're going to have to decide what is okay or not. And I'm not going to make that decision for a woman, obviously. But I just think in general, if technology gets to that point where it becomes its own purpose, it becomes extremely dangerous and possibly subject to lots of large-scale abuse, right?
Okay, so we got the idea that technology is not its own end, but it's rather a means to an end. So the question then is, how do we sustain that status quo, or how do we implement that idea in reality?
Well, I mean, another central statement in my book is embrace technology, but don't become it, right? So that is a political and social contract question. Right? Let's say I'm going to embrace technology, but don't become it. What does it mean? Well, it means, for example, that if I take care of customer relationships and CRM and ERP and so on via technology, that's beneficial for customers by and large. If they can talk to my digital assistant and get quicker advice, that's a benefit, right? But I'm not going to force the customer to wear an augmented piece so they can talk to me, or I'm going to treat my customer like an algorithm. Right? I mean, the human world is not algorithmic. It's actually completely the opposite, what I call androrhythm, right? Human things. Right? And so if I force people to then become part of that environment, that would be not a good thing. Right? So this is really a question of the balance.
Yes, but the reply, of course, would be, look, Gerd, nobody's forcing people to do Facebook or Snapchat or Twitter or G+, and to give away all their data for free, as they're clearly very willingly doing so right now by the billions, right?
Yeah, but that's exactly the same argument as saying that nobody's forcing you to buy a gun when the police isn't doing their job and the guns are cheap, right? And you feel threatened, you buy a gun. I mean, most Americans have 2 guns, right? And there's the same argument saying like, okay, why are they doing that? Because they feel that they're not being protected or whatever the reason is, right? And so it's their own choice. Well, that's true, but let's fix the real problem, which is that they feel like they have to do that because they're not protected, right? And that is the problem we need to fix. Just like terrorism is a result of people feeling that their life is utterly useless, right? They're going to die anyway, right? So these are larger questions. And I think that to say that basically it's people's own choices, well, that's also not true for drugs. And these are drugs, right? I mean, let's make no mistake about this. The internet is the biggest drug ever invented. And I'm fine with people using drugs within reason, whatever they want to do. But to use drug use as a default way of living, I think that we need some supervision on those issues, right? I mean,
So where does that supervision come from, and how is it going to be implemented?
yeah, well, this is a social contract that we usually painstakingly work out, right? There are social contracts that govern our lives everywhere. There's a social contract here in Switzerland that you don't drop your paper when you go hiking in the mountains, and everybody will run after you and give you a hard time, right? And this is not a law. Well, it is a law, but nobody cares about that being a law, but it's a social contract. And it's a social contract that you don't show up drunk for work. And the same social contract says when you're out with the guys after work, you can drink, right? So it's basically, this is something we have agreed on. And some of it are regulations, some are laws, other ones are just traditions, and they clash, right?
Mm-hmm.
Of course,
Yeah.
right? We do need a bottom line on the very crucial issues that we're facing with technology, because technology is questioning every single ethical and value paradigm ever invented the last 200 years, right? Including stuff like automatic killing machines for the army. Right?
Absolutely, yeah. I actually wrote my master's thesis in 2006. This is how I got into the field. I was doing my political science degree thesis, and I was looking for an interesting topic to write on, and I didn't want to do something like World War I or World War II. So I took the drone warfare, and I wrote actually a thesis on artificial intelligence in times of war, and my research was on the drone warfare in Iraq and Afghanistan in 2006 and 7. And at the time, the political science department didn't find it very interesting or very relevant, believe it or not.
Yes, you're also a futurist. I think that this question is a question of consensus, and a question just like we have agreed that we shouldn't have any more countries having nuclear bombs, right? And we do have one that is trying, and that is a problem, but we manage. And so the best thing we can hope for is that we have these multiple issues. We find conversations, and we have treaties and agreements, and they're trying to be enforced in some sort, that we reach a place to where it's manageable. Mm-hmm. Not a place to where we would just stop it, right? Because obviously, for artificial intelligence, we have no way of just saying, well, you can't do that or something, right? But we're going to need to have an agreement on what is okay and what is not, because we cannot leave that agreement to people making money with this very same product that is going to change our way of life forever.
Now, you say that just because we can, it doesn't mean that we shouldn't, which is precisely along the lines that you're talking about right now. And then furthermore, on page 15, you say, technology doesn't have ethics, but society without one is doomed. So, and it seems right now, Gerd, that we don't have an agreement. We don't have an ethical treaty, as you call it, which spans across borders. So, are we doomed?
Well, I would be much more positive than that. We have a lot of ethics that we actually agree on, and some of them are more sort of ephemeral. Like, we generally agree that we shouldn't kill each other. There are exceptions, right? But that is a general agreement. Okay, we have a lot of ethics that we subscribe to on a global level that are sometimes hard to pinpoint, but we do seem to have the same purpose, right? We want to live peacefully, create our own lives, have self-fulfillment, the Maslow need pyramid and all these things. But I think the process of discussing these really important decisions, right? For example, at what point do you cease to be human? If you augment yourself with technology, which is becoming possible in a cyborg state, whether it's internally or externally, at what point do you cease to be human, or rather, at what point do they become human? Right? Mm-hmm. And that's a question we have to answer. And the other questions are like really simple stuff, like if we are able, for example, to have abundant energy or abundant medical, or if we can end dying, should we sell that or should it be free? Well, my view is we clearly should be free, because you cannot possibly sell a solution to human suffering on that scale. That's bad enough with AIDS medication, but imagine you could defeat cancer if you have $1 million.
Well, let's take those two issues like on a step-by-step basis. So first, about the issue of at what point do you cease to be human? So obviously, I think in order to address that question, we first have to have a definition that's commonly agreed upon or accepted as per what it is to be human. And I would venture to suggest that the definition of what it means to be human is not a common one that we share across humanity across the planet, and especially changes, it seems to me, in terms of as the time changes, as the epoch changes, the definition of what it means to be human changes. So in other words, how do you say that something ceases to be, which is kind of vague and kind of flexible and changes in terms of time and space?
Yeah, I mean, this is the most difficult question, of course, that we need to ask ourselves, and let's see what that actually means. I think it's a bit early for the discussion because we're pretty far away from those possibilities. But I mean, we take nootropics right now to perform better at work, right? Of course, we take cholesterol pills and all those kind of things. But those are very, very minor things. Well, they're actually major things, but they're considered to be minor, as opposed to saying I'm going to connect my neocortex to the internet, like Ray Kurzweil is proposing, right? My main issue with all of that is that we cease to be functional as a human after we do that. Because
what's that mean, though? I mean, just let's try and
explain
it.
We just couldn't and wouldn't want to be without it anymore. I mean, imagine the possibility of tapping into the, with an IQ of 50,000, tapping into a machine with an IQ of 50,000 through a wireless connection of your brain. That would be extremely powerful, and we would never want to be without it. And so the question is at a certain point, what is left for us to be, and as far as Dasein, as they say in German, the existence, right? If we do that, for example, it would probably be quite addictive to work in a virtual environment with a surrounding screen, and then imagine at the end of the day you put that down and you step into this measly world of your two eyes, right? Mm-hmm. That's already quite a stretch, and then we have to decide, okay, what does that mean? And do we have to be wired or we get fired, right? Wired or fired, or what are the rules around this? And what does it take? I mean, in many ways, I've come up with this new thing after I wrote the book, which I call the EPA for humanity, so the Environmental Protection Agency for Humanity. Do we have to have an agency that says, this is a human thing that we must keep because it's worth something? Well, it is inefficient, it's expensive, it's cumbersome, it's going to be a pain in the butt, but it's something we need to keep. That is a part of, and do we fence this like a national park, right? Mm-hmm. Like for example, in Europe, we want to fence privacy, right? Mm-hmm. We want to say privacy is not something to be discussed. It's just something that we must keep, and it doesn't matter what it means. Right? It doesn't matter if that's going to be a pain in the butt for those guys or not. It's just something that we must keep, right?
And you're proposing a similar approach to the idea of humanity.
Well, of course, it gets more complicated there because of the multiple variants of this, right? For example, if you're sick or not, or whatever, right? And what we don't want to do is we don't want to stand in the way of solving large issues that are beneficial to us, right? So we can't just say that we're going to say, well, that's like saying we don't do any nuclear fusion, right?
I'm just trying to figure out if we're able to both have our cake and eat it too. Because, some of the super protagonists or optimists would say, oh, just disrupt everything, go for it full head, and, let the chips fall where they may, and laissez-faire attitude about sort of the future and everything. Then others would say, well, we can't go very strict about regulation or, committees that you propose because that's going to be very ineffective, very inefficient, and it will stop innovation. So I'm trying to see, how are you proposing that we can sort of take the middle path and have our cake and eat it too, perhaps?
Well, I think
can we?
Well, that's what I'm working on. I'm working on that whole debate. But basically, I mean, the book is only the beginning in that debate. It's not a conclusive answer to all of those questions, and I'm certainly not in charge of all these questions. Not yet. I'm just kidding. But the thing is, in the end, this concept of the invisible hand, the self-regulated market, and the power of that's all just American stuff, right? And it has worked. And it can work, but it's not a recipe for the future. When you have a really complex world and you have to make decisions like this, right? It's like, we had a vote on immigration 2 years ago in Switzerland, and all the people who are not connected and who are not international in Switzerland voted against immigration, and now we can't have people immigrate, which is a huge problem. Right? Should we really have people decide on these fundamental issues on a one-by-one vote, right? The same happened in Colombia, the same happened with the Brexit, right? I mean,
what's the alternative, though?
I think we need to have leadership that actually understands these issues like some of us and some of the people in this discussion do, and actually have a full-time job of just doing that. And because it requires a lot of oversight and discussion and foresight, which most people don't have. And not to say that they shouldn't vote on it, but it's very hard to vote on something where you have no clue what in the world you're talking about. Right? I mean, we're not going to have the public voting on the power of artificial intelligence. Right? I mean, I don't know, that would be a stretch. And so I think that the thing is, in the end, this is a question of survival for us. Right? We need to, and we always have in the past, found a way of saying that this is what we need to keep, this is what we're willing to pay, this is the price we pay, this is what we can live with, and that's what happens in a democratic society. Right? Otherwise, we have the tyranny of technology. Right? We have a tyranny that says, okay, we can do it, so shut up and just move forward.
Let me bring another issue here, though. Speaking of votes in Switzerland, not long ago, you actually had a vote on universal basic income too, and of course, just like immigration, and just like the Colombian peace plan, it got voted down by a large margin. If I say it was something like 80 to 20%, if I remember.
Yes, but that's true. But this vote was actually really positive. Here in Zurich, 57% of people voted for it.
Wow.
And the fact that you would have 23% of the Swiss population voting for it is huge, right? I mean, if you have this vote in the US, it would be 0.0000, and they're willing to pay for it too, right? Which is, I mean, this is a huge step forward. So if you see it in perspective here, ultimately, I think the question of the basic income is related to what I talk about in the book. It is totally obvious. Technology will solve so many things for us, and it has a power to automate and make things abundant, that we won't need to work like we do now. And this is a foregone conclusion. And we shouldn't be crying about the loss of jobs, because the loss of jobs is just the jobs that people had to make a living, right? Most of those that don't love being a truck driver or cleaning in the airport, they just do that because it's a job, right? So in 20 years, we don't need to do that. And then we have to find a way to distribute the benefits of why we don't need it. And this is the trouble in America, for example, that distribution of collective benefits is just a total no-no. Right? And so this is
some would say that's the same with the Brexit vote, actually. The consensus is that, or one of the very strong ideas as why Brexit happened in England is because that's a way of the have-nots to kick at the status quo, to say, we're not sharing of any of the benefits that you guys supposedly tell us that we're going to have now, and therefore we want to change the status quo no matter what. And so they're going to vote against anything that's associated with the current state of affairs, and hence Brexit.
Well, the Brexit is the only bet I've lost in 10 years on the future. So I've bet that it wouldn't happen. And I was really, the first time I was totally wrong on what would happen. And that's really one of those wild, those black swans that comes up. And I think my opinion on that was highly rigged up through social media, and it shows the power of manipulation, just like Colombia. The decision not to have the peace accord. And I mean, it's a complex question, but I think that some of those direct referendums are difficult to handle in that regard, in that you don't have an even slate. And so sometimes we're better off to have that decision made by the people that I vote for. But the
reason why I'm bringing this in is also because currently we're, I think, observing the same thing happening in the United States, actually, where a large percentage of the population is supporting one candidate, Donald Trump, not because of his own personal qualities or character qualities, but rather because he, to them, represents someone outside of the system. And since that they have seen no benefit within the system, they want to do and go for anything that would suggest a change.
Yeah, well, I perceive that to be another proof of the fundamental dysfunctional system of American politics and life in general. It's just one of those things where you say, like, this is like a TV show. Right?
It is like a TV show, but we are here. I'm here in Canada, even though most of my actually audience is American. My wife is American, and I have to say, I think we're not too different. I mean, Canada is very close. England is another example. We, in my opinion, are not too different. It's not impossible. It's harder for this to happen here, but I don't think it's entirely impossible, to be honest. And it's just that probably we're a little bit more equitable society, perhaps, than and don't suffer those extremities as much as the US does.
Well, this is a little bit one of my worries that I express in the book is that, I lived in the US for 15 years. I do a lot of business there. There's a lot of great people there. I feel in general that, if we are going to be determined by what people decide in Silicon Valley and at DARPA, that I would fear for the future. Right? Because it is all just about a few select things, and it creates giant inequality. And now, for the first time, 2 weeks ago, the tech companies got together and said, "Oh shit, we really have to be about the benefit of people in society," which I find astounding. It may all just be a bunch of fig leaves, but I'm launching, by the way, an open letter on this tomorrow.
Right, but it's showing some progress, which is very, very encouraging.
Yeah, I mean, it's like for the first time, the admission of saying, not all of that is solved by cool technology. Happiness is not an app. And neither is equality, right? These are things that happen between people. I mean, the most important things in our lives happen between people, right?
You see, those are the things that I completely agree with you on, like 100%. And that's why I really like and appreciate your book, because you keep reinforcing that message, which I think, especially in Silicon Valley, but also in general, has not had enough coverage, which is the message I've been trying to shout for 7 years, kind of.
Well, this is part of the challenge there is, relationships between people take building, and they take endurance, and they have conflict, and they go up and down, and you build something, and at the end you have something solid, right? That's a 10,000-hour work job, it's huge, right? And now technology says, never mind all of that. Here's a shortcut, how we can create an immediate relationship with this beautiful robot, right? And if you're tired of it, you can disengage. Right? And that is the promise of future technology, right? Is that we can have these wormholes that say, you don't want to learn an instrument, play with this, and you immediately become Jimi Hendrix. Right? It's like, come on, that is not what we are. That is not how it works. Some processes are just processes that we go through. And technology can't just say, what, never mind all of that. Here's a way of shortcutting all of that, right? Just give me $5. That's just a lie. It's deception.
Gerd, talk to me a little bit about your concept of core versus the popular concept of STEM.
Yeah, I think that I used to call the core used to be called HECI, right? Humanity, ethics, creativity, and imagination, which is really the same definition, right? And one discussion in the book is that we tend to focus on those tangible things like business planning and science and technology, engineering, math, right? Because that seems like a safe thing, right? But now it turns out actually anything that's routine can be and will be replaced by a computer.
Yes.
And a lot of science and technology ends up being a routine as well, right? Even invention is going to be. I mean, we already have cloud biology, right? Having labs run experiments in the sky and simulating them, right? So I think we need to teach our kids that technology is a fact of life, and they have to understand that clearly, and they should know how to code. I agree with that, right? But then is the human things, which are called the algorithms in the book, right? Compassion, originality, reciprocity, all these, the things that we need to create the glue, and we have to study those. That's also where the value is being created. The value of business relationships is in trust. It is not in some, I mean, you can go to a company and say, okay, great, you have fantastic technology, I really love it. But how long does that last? A week, right? You don't buy it.
It's replaced by the next thing. Whereas you're suggesting that the lasting things are what you call core: creativity, compassion, originality, reciprocity, responsibility, and empathy.
Right. I mean, those are the things that are, of course, I mean, this is a very old tradition of philosophy thinking, right? Is that, and sometimes I like to say with technology, we have abundance outside, but scarcity on the inside, right? So we have all the options on the outside. We can buy anything, we can go anywhere, we have abundant everything, and that will be true. But inside, we still haven't moved on. We still have not found the happiness we're looking for. And how you find that, I'm not going to talk about how you find that. That is a whole different discussion. But
Yeah, no, but that's a very important point, though. I mean, even if we ignore the part of how do you find it, the part that, we are surrounded by technology, we're drowning in technology, and it doesn't seem to make us any happier. That's a very important realization to have, I think.
Well, I mean, the human quality of relationships and meaning and connectivity and actual conversations and friendships and all these things are things that are organic, right? We don't perceive those things with our brain, right?
Mhm.
They're actually holistic. I mean, we have those things, as Kahneman said, the philosopher, the psychologist, Nobel Prize winning psychologist Daniel Kahneman said, cognition is embodied. We think with the body, not the brain.
Right.
So and we live with the body, right? We are not just this, right? And this is something I really don't like about transhumanism and singularity, is this concept that we can have this physical copy of our brain activity and that will be it, right? I think that, well, maybe that's eventually true in a couple of hundred years. Maybe. No, I don't think so. But it doesn't matter, because right now that's just utter fiction. And it's also a very bad idea, because why would we do that? I mean,
So
what are we
yeah,
gaining?
yeah, tell me, what is wrong with transhumanism in your view? What's the problem with transhumanism?
Well, it's a concept of saying that we can be upgraded like a machine, and that we are missing something. Right? Yes, we miss lots of things. We screw up, we make mistakes, we kill each other, we do all these bad things, right? But if you start saying, well, because you are, let's say, an unfaithful husband, right? So then I'm going to remove the possibility of you being unfaithful, right? Whatever that could mean. I would remove many other things at the same time. And this is just, the world is a mess, and people are messy. And that is the way that we live, right? And we make mistakes and we do all these bad things. But should we then say that technology can remove all of those causes of badness? Right? When we do that, we remove everything else. It's like cutting out a piece of cancer. You cut out the whole thing, right?
But walk with me a little bit further here, because this is one thing where I don't quite agree with you. Because here's my thing: technology, education is a kind of technology, if you will, right? It's a way of taking a child, which is an empty hard drive, tabula rasa, as I think it was Locke who used to call us, tabula rasa, empty tablet, right? Nothing on the hard drive, no operating system, no formatting. And then through education, we become hopefully better people with experience, with making mistakes and all those things. How is technology different than education? I mean, education is technology. Books, you love books. You say you love books. Books are technology, right? Even music. You're a musician. Your guitar. I bet you love your electric guitar, because I could tell just by the way you were riffing on that thing, which was awesome, by the way. But that's also technology. And imagine if we didn't have the technology and we had Mozart, no one would have ever known he existed, because the technology wasn't invented. Or if we didn't have the technology of paints when Van Gogh was born, for
Yeah,
example.
I mean that's all true, but of course the multitude of technology is a huge difference. I mean, having a piano or having a printed book or having the internet, that's all one thing compared to technology actually going inside of us, right? Because it's still on the outside of me, right? And those are tools, nice tools. But when I make myself a tool by putting technology in myself, then I become the tool, right? I'm no longer a tool maker, I'm a tool.
Mhm,
Right? I'm made by somebody else's tool.
mhm.
And we cross that border is that this is not just going to be us being a better tool, it's a fundamentally different species. Right?
So for you, the cutting point is to not become a tool. As you say, we should embrace technology, but not become technology. Or another way of saying that is to use the tool, which is technology, rather than to become it. That's for you the point of no return, is it?
Yeah, well, I wouldn't. Yeah, I mean, basically yes, but I wouldn't put it that black and white. For example, right now we're using tools like cholesterol pills, right? And they, even though they're mostly not working, but we think they are working and it makes lots of money. It's it can be done. It's not such a bad thing, but there's a certain gradual cutoff point, right?
Mm.
That we need to define what that is. And as technology has not been able to go inside my bloodstream and eat my cholesterol with a nanobot, right? But that is becoming possible. And then in 10, 15, 20 years, basically everything is becoming possible. Right?
Mm-hmm.
And then we can say, well, it's possible, so that's a good thing, right? Because eventually it will cover our range of what we are as a human in a completely different way, right? And none of that was a big deal
It
in the
would
beginning of
shift
it.
the meaning of humanity. I agree with you entirely. But again, as I proposed beforehand, however, isn't that what has happened in the past, in every epoch, with the great discoveries, with the Renaissance, and so on, the Age of Reason, humanity, the meaning of the understanding thereof
Sure.
has shifted.
I mean, if you would say that at a certain point we are inevitably merging with technology and becoming tools and robots and machines ourselves, then that is a logical conclusion that this is a good thing, right? And I'm saying that I think this is not a good thing because
Mm-hmm.
we would at that point lose so many other things and we could not compete in this world of machines. Because, I mean, an artificial intelligence that runs at 50 quadrillion calculations per second with an IQ of 500,000 is in any case going to be more powerful than me, no matter what I do, right? And so then the question is, who runs it, right? And what does it aspire to, right? And it won't be conscious, but okay, but it will still run my life. And I think that at that point is we have to answer that question as to, who's in charge of that system at what point.
Yeah, I agree with you very much to that extent on that topic, very much, that we have to be careful not to become tools or mere cogs in the machine of technology and of artificial intelligence. But let me ask you more about your views, however. What's your take on the technological singularity? How realistic of a concept it is? And if it is, then what are our chances of surviving it?
Well, I agree with Ray and the Singularity people on this concept that it's inevitable that computers reach the human capacity, and I would say probably quicker than we think. I think Ray says 29, and then he said 25. I think it's realistic, something like 7 years.
7 years?
For a computer to be able to match the capacity of the human brain, and at that point, basically multiply itself.
Oh, I think he was talking about 2028 about that. So I would say 11, 12 years maybe.
Yeah, I think it's going to be a little bit earlier than that because of various things that we're
Oh, it's
currently
possible.
inventing.
Yeah, I mean, we saw Deep Blue defeated AlphaGo, defeated the best human Go player months ago now, and that was not expected to happen for another 10 years. So yeah.
Yeah, I mean, however, I think that the Deep Blue experience also shows what is really happening here is that these thinking machines, and cognitive computing, they think, but they don't think like we think, right?
Yes.
They think like a machine thinks, and they'll probably get lots of better. We think holistically with everything that we've got. We think and feel and exist, right?
Yeah.
We exist, and the computer will never exist. And it can simulate existence, right? It can probably be good at that eventually, but it can never actually exist in the same way. And so I think it's plenty if we have cognitive computers that can think on their own in some way that they think, right? They don't have to think like us at all. It would be plenty useful if they can do that and solve our global problems that we have, right?
Mm-hmm.
But we should not give them the authority to say that because they do that, then everything they do is the right thing to do, right? Because we know from airline accidents, for example, that this is just not the case, right?
Yeah, I agree. I agree.
And so this is a good thing to use, but is it the truth or the only solution? And this is
We
where,
have to be careful. In other words, as some people have called this the black box problem, right?
yeah,
Where something happens within the system, and because no one is aware of what and why it's happening, no one can control or question it or fix it, and we're all just basically fait accompli. We're forced to accept the result, whatever it is.
well, yeah, I mean, if we don't practice what we can and what we do, we lose the skill of applying it. We forget ourselves, right?
Mhm.
And so this starts with dating and Tinder. That's really a low-level example, right? And it goes all the way to using intelligent digital assistants to go shopping or take care of your education or basically applicating our own thing. And this is very much like, the accident of Air France over the Atlantic from Rio happened because of pilot error, because of bad performance, and because the machine disengaged and said, I can't do anymore, take over, and they misunderstood the machine. Right? And exactly the same thing happens here with us. As we give all that power to technology, we get lazy and we retract, right? And we get unskilled. Right?
In other words, we should make sure that we can still fly the plane and not get used to be running it on autopilot all the time.
Well, in the case of the airplane, I would argue we should let the machines fly it completely. Right? You can't have that halfway solution, right? But then that would solve the problem there, because there's no human right to fly an airplane, or it doesn't matter, you know.
So that's part of the problem. How do you draw the line? For one thing, it's okay. For another thing, is not. That's what I'm trying to bring here to light.
Yeah, well, I think the question we have to ask ourselves when we use technology: am I using this in such a way that it's empowering what I can still do? Or am I abdicating my responsibility? For example, if there was a voting bot, right, that would vote for me based on that already exists, but I'm sure somebody is going to offer it, right? Or if I use that exogenesis artificial womb, right, so I can go about my work and have the baby just at 5 o'clock on Friday before I have drinks, that would be a question of saying, am I disempowering myself? And that's the question we have to ask.
Mm-hmm. Well, to be honest with you, if you ask my wife, she would say, oh, I'm all for having that baby with, exogenesis rather than doing it the way. And, if I try to say anything, she would just say, oh, you're a man, you don't understand. So.
Yeah, but this will be the same argument of saying, you know what, I'm fine with a nuclear power plant in my front yard because I need lots of power. I need to have lots of power in my living room, and the power plant is fine, right? And this would be saying, well, you ignore everything around it. I mean, it is quite clear, for example, there's people arguing that kids shouldn't learn languages because they can use apps. Mm-hmm. Kids shouldn't learn how to write by hand because they can speak to the computer, right? Mm-hmm. Every single doctor that knows anything knows that these are essential processes for development of the brain. And so we're not just going to say, well, let's take this wormhole shortcut and then we use 50 of those shortcuts and then we stop existing, basically.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so the solution that you propose is what you call digital ethics, and you have a number of rules and rights that are not the final solutions, but are rather the starting point of a discussion, the launching of a conversation, and you kind of make yourself vulnerable by putting a number of proposals. Would you share a little bit about those with us?
Yeah, I think that they're still very uncooked. They're kind of raw in many ways, right? The stuff that we should or should not do, right? For example, I think we need to not put efficiency over humanity. So that means if we are in a situation where people can do a good job at work, we should not get rid of them just because they're not efficient enough, right?
I agree. Sorry for the interruption, but I agree with you 100% on that. And if you want to read the antithesis of your book and what I would have called the efficiency utopia, is my next podcast episode on the book by Robin Hanson called The Age of M, which in my view is the exact efficiency utopia where democracy is ineffective and inefficient. One vote, one person, one vote doesn't work well. We don't get enough work out of people because we are not working to live, but rather we're living to work, and all those things in one package. So that's the antithesis. Anyway.
Yeah, this is just I think it really comes down to how you view the world and how you view people as to how you would make those decisions. And I generally wouldn't think it's a good idea to forbid people those options, except for when they encroach on other options, that other people may have, or if they create a drug-like atmosphere. Right? Mm-hmm. So to where I know I'm no longer actually in charge with what I'm doing because I'm inside of this vortex. Right? I can't decide any other way. And in many ways, Facebook is also a great example for that because no matter how hard you try, you really can't leave Facebook now. Yeah. We're hooked, right? And
especially
if we leave,
if you have a small business or a big business like you do.
So, we can kind of laugh about this. It's not a big thing, but when we created this dependency on other technology like intelligent digital assistants and all these things that are coming, and all the big technology companies are creating this giant brain in the sky, that they want us to use, and this is our outsourced duplicate of myself, right? And so there's a way of meeting that. So again, my recommendations is to say, okay, there's a bunch of things we should discuss that all start we should not, right?
Yeah.
So, for example, I think we should not allow a human machine convergence, or let's say cyborgism, except for medical circumstances and those kind of things that are required, but not just because we can, and create essentially a new breed of man. People will do that anyway when they can do that, but the question is the one of social acceptance of that being normal. And I mean, it's bad enough if I think the number is like 60% of Brazilian women at a certain age have body alterations, right? They are go get plastic surgery just because they can, right? That's a choice of them. But for us to say that these choices are becoming normal, right? That means you're no longer normal if you're normal, right? I mean, how would you exist in a world where everybody has this and you don't because you're some...
The problem, though, is again the same problem we had with being human. How do you define what's normal?
Well, all we have to do is define the bottom lines of that, right? Like we have now, right? It's normal behavior in parentheses, or within a certain degree of how we behave as kind of a social contract, right? How we do things, and the rest is regulation. For example, we regulated the oil companies, but we're not regulating the data companies, and they are the new oil companies, the most powerful companies in the world, right?
Yeah.
And so there's no oversight, there's no regulation, there's no taking responsibility. There is some, but not much. And now they're saying, well, we should really think about what that does to people in society, which is a good move, but it's high time that we think about that as being important, right? It's not just important to crank up the economy, especially because 95% of it is in the US, right? What do we get from that?
Well, I agree. I agree with many of your proposals there that they're important starting point for a conversation, and I agree that they're not quite cooked yet. But I don't think how I can do any better myself or anyone else at this moment. So the conversation is very important, and then hopefully together we can come up to some kind of consensus.
Yeah.
But let me talk a little bit something about here the next step, which is capitalism, because I've interviewed, as I said, a couple hundred people, and especially economist futurists, such as Robin Hanson and a number of others, it's easier for them to see the end of the world than the end of capitalism.
Mm-hmm.
Can you comment on that? How do you see that as a futurist yourself?
Well, I think it's quite obvious, and when we look at technology, is that we're moving to what has been referred to as post-capitalism, right? Or a situation to where if things are abundant because technology makes them abundant, right, then the business model of that used to be, it collapses. I mean, the business model of the music business has collapsed because music is free, or it's like water, right? So you have 20 million songs on Spotify, you pay $10. What does that mean per song? It means nothing per song, right? And so, but that is a good thing. I now imagine if everybody paid the $10 or even $1, right, we would go back to a good system, right? So it's basically capitalism in a different way, right? And I think ultimately we're ending up at a place where music is abundant, films are abundant, transportation is abundant, banking is abundant, health is abundant, water is abundant, energy is abundant, right? And what does it do to capitalism? Well, it evaporates the whole idea of consumption. And that's only 20 years away. And also evaporates the idea of work.
And what happens to all the struggling musicians? Do they all become futurists like you?
Well, for musicians, it won't make much of a difference, or for artists, right? Because they haven't made any money anyway. Pretty much any time they haven't made any money. So it's like the idea of being out there creating your business model is nothing new to musicians, right? And this is why I'm saying like a lot of artists will be very well prepared for this world. But I think it does force us to think about the underlying rules of capitalism, consumption, profit, growth. I think we're going to see a stock market in the next 5 years that is going to be built on the triple bottom line scenario, on larger values, the sort of Star Trek economy that people have suggested. We will have to think about that as a natural development eventually.
Gerd, I have to say that I am really tremendously enjoying our conversation with you, and I can keep you for ages. But I know you already had
I gotta go.
a huge day behind you. And actually, where were you presenting today? Was it in Portugal?
I was in Lisbon yesterday for the digital summit, and was a great event. And this morning I did a documentary shooting with one of the local companies and did a small speech to a bunch of business people. And
Oh,
tomorrow I'm going to India. So
oh wow. Okay, so it better not keep you too late then. So let me ask you, for those of our audience who are interested in following your work and what you do, what's the best place for them to find more about you?
yes, I have a lot of things online. So if you have the next 5 years on a lonely island and an internet connection, which is unlikely, of course, then you have to download all of it. But you go to futuristgerd.com. Gerd is Gerd, like gastrointestinal reflux disease, same thing. Futuristgerd.com. I also have a lot of stuff on YouTube. I have a shortcut called GerdTube, Gerd tube.com. That's how you get to my YouTube channel. And of course, the book is at Tech versus Human, so techvshuman.com, where you can also read quite a bit in the book, right? And in general, if you just Google Gerd, Gerd, and Futurist, you'll find more than enough. And most of my presentations are Creative Commons licensed, and all my videos are, so you can download them and re-edit them and do
That's
as you
very
please.
interesting. They're Creative Commons license. Do you put that as a requirement when you go to speak? How does that work?
Well, sometimes I do, sometimes I don't. But it's basically, if it's public, then it's public, and you can cut it and edit it. You cannot just use it and say it's yours. That's the Creative Commons attribution license. But it's basically for public use, and all my images and slideshows can be reused and are widely reused. My current book is not Creative Commons; it's with the publisher. But in reality, a lot of these themes are floating around everywhere.
Fascinating. So, Gerd, we've been talking today for nearly 90 minutes.
Okay.
What is the best way to wrap up our conversation? What is the best single message that you would like to send our audience away with? What should we take from Gerd Leonhard, the futurist, today?
Yeah, I think that, well, there's three core messages. One is I think we have to really understand that the world is changing exponentially. And you can't just sit there and observe and expect that to be a learning process. It's going to be so fundamentally different in 5 years and 10 years that you won't even recognize a lot of things. So understanding exponentiality is crucial.
As you say, if we sit and wait, we're dead.
Yeah, so that is something we have. And the second point is that to get more awareness on these topics about technology and what it does, that changes the way that you respond to create your own future. And I think the third point would be borrowed from David Bowie: "The future belongs to those who can hear it coming." So if you are, and I think this is a very important point, if you can hear it coming, you automatically start creating things that are what you want to see. And the worst thing you can do is to not pay attention when it's coming. And that is a process, I think, that no matter whether you're a businessman or an artist, right, you have to have foresight on what's coming. And the next 5 years are plenty if you could do that, right? And to get tuned up to that, because otherwise, I think that we may get to a point where we feel out of touch or out of control.
Where's that reference coming from, by the way? Is it a song of David Bowie's that I can't bring up right now?
No, he was quite a visionary, and he quoted those things all the time. In fact, the theme of my first book, Music Like Water, is from David Bowie, and he dropped those stuff in the media all the time.
Wow.
So it's basically, I mean, of course, he was the first one to create an ISP, right, an internet service provider. And I think, as a summary, my position on technology is widely positive and 90% good, right? We need to make sure that the unintended consequences and the side effects and the externalities, right? We have to make sure that they're not going to be bigger than the positive, and we're at the junction now to where we have to think about what that means, and we have to get every politician and every public official to be accountable for that.
I think that's a fantastic point to stop and digest our conversation and to ponder the parting thought that the future belongs to those who can hear it coming. So with that, Gerd Leonhard, thank you very much for being with us today.
You're welcome.
you guys enjoy this show, you can help me make it better in a couple of ways. You can go and write a review on iTunes, or you can simply make a donation.